The Titanic, for a century, has been hidden in darkness, 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers down, at the bottom of the Atlantic. But now, a new expedition is about to drain the ocean, pull the plug of the Atlantic, and reveal the wreck of the Titanic for the first time in 100 years. In the bright light of day, we uncover critical new pieces of evidence. From giant gouges on the ocean floor to overlooked damage from the iceberg that sliced her open. A team of scientists equipped with cutting-edge tools now solve long-standing mysteries of the disaster and rewrites the Titanic's story. Drained dry in the seabed, this is the wreck of the Titanic as you've never seen it before. April 1912. RMS Titanic embarks on her maiden voyage. In its day, Titanic is a technological marvel, the largest moving man-made object on the planet. Her engineers brag that she is unsinkable, but her terrifying fate is now a legend. 4,000 kilometers into her transatlantic voyage, disaster strikes. The ship plows into an iceberg. In just 2.5 hours, RMS Titanic is on the bottom of the Atlantic.
The Titanic is the victim of the ultimate unexpected accident.
More than 1,500 passengers are killed. Many dragged through the icy depths of the ocean. But over a century later, we still don't know exactly what happened that night.
We have lots of historical information, but often there are biases in those historical accounts. Even the eyewitnesses of the sinking of Titanic had many different perceptions of how that sinking took place. So the best way to unravel some of those questions is to use science.
For 75 years, the Titanic is lost, until 1985. At long last, the Titanic is discovered nearly 600 kilometers off the coast of Newfoundland. What remains of the proud ship is cloaked in dark, freezing waters. It's a harsh and dangerous environment. The wreckage is spread across an underwater desert, 12,000 feet, nearly 3,800 meters, straight down. That's nearly 7 CN towers stacked on top of each other. Though there has been nearly 150 trips to the wreck site, no one has been able to see the wreck site in its entirety.
In the past, trying to understand Titanic with the existing technology was like trying to draw a map of downtown Manhattan. From the height of a 10-story building, in a vehicle that has the windows fogged up, it's pitch black, and you're trying to look at it through a flashlight. Challenging, to say the least.
There are lingering mysteries on how Titanic sank. How much damage did the iceberg cause? When did the ship break apart? How does she exactly lie in the seabed? Is there a way to peer down into this hostile world and examine the wreckage like a crash scene investigator? The answer is yes. But only due to the results of an ambitious expedition in 2010 called the Titanic Mapping Project.
We really didn't know what the disposition of the ship was. We really didn't know what was actually there, where it was, and what shape it was in.
The 2010 expedition to Titanic was envisioned as an opportunity to systematically and completely map the entire site.
A team of scientists, engineers, historians, and explorers scan, photograph, and record 3D video of Titanic with high-tech underwater equipment. AUVs, autonomous underwater vehicles, are programmed to crisscross the seabed as if mowing a gigantic lawn, back and forth, collecting billions of data points. ROVs, a remote-operated vehicle, takes hours of high-definition video and thousands of photographs.
In the early days, we were confronted with a blue, grainy image from the bottom of the sea, and you could kind of make out what you were looking at. Today, the images are crisp and clear, and it's almost like you were there. The water is almost completely transparent. For the first time ever, we can begin to actually see in this world that we're exploring.
But no matter how sharp the underwater images are, the wreck can still only be seen in small segments. The goal is to create the most detailed picture of the Titanic wreckage ever created. The mapping expedition returns to shore with a mountain of data, but the work has only just begun.
To get that data the first time and to look at it and know that you were looking at the Titanic and all the artifacts and seeing the bow and seeing the stern in so much detail, looking at all that data and seeing that for the first time was pretty amazing.
Robert Goodwin and his team begin digging into the data. Experts stitch together high-resolution sonar images of the entire wreck site. Others create photomosaics that will revolutionize the field of oceanography. And by merging the sonar and visual pictures, experts create an unprecedented 3D model of the site. When processed, this hard data gives us the ability to do something spectacular. We can now virtually peel back the sea, strip away the waters of the Atlantic, remove trillions of liters of ocean water, and reveal for the first time the wreck of the Titanic. At last, the site can be seen fully, completely, and with startling clarity. It's a view of Titanic like we've never had before. This is the Titanic drained.
It's almost like the fog has been cleared away. They can now start to see through the water, through the murkiness of the deep sea and the darkness, the perpetual darkness. We've cleared that away.
The idea of draining the Titanic presents the site in a whole different light. It's not impenetrable. It's right there in front of us to explore.
With the Titanic drained, investigators now have an overview of the entire site and its boundaries. The total area is over 1.5 square kilometers, the size of 185 football fields. Immediately, the biggest sections of the ship leap out.
The site of RMS Titanic can be described pretty basically as two large features. The bow section and the stern section, which are about 1/2 mile apart, and then numerous debris fields.
In all, there are 5 debris fields, each scattered with fragments of the ship and objects that tumbled out as she sank. Titanic experts are now drilling down into the data, trying to solve long-standing mysteries about what happened. They're beginning with the biggest piece of all, the bow. For years, scientists have been trying to understand exactly how this 500-foot, 152-meter section of the ship traveled to the bottom and impacted the ocean floor. Our 3D model shows the bow standing tall and proud. It's been ripped apart from the rest of the ship, but its structure is still largely intact.
Titanic represented a far more intact time capsule than any of us had ever imagined.
As experts scrutinize the bow in the expedition video, they spot a fascinating clue. All around the front of the ship, the seabed sediments are strangely discolored.
It appears as though that it's got something to do with the impact of that section on the seafloor. And you see it in the bow, certainly around the bow, you see this bloom. The sediments are definitely different.
The sediments are a vital forensic record of the moment the bow hit the bottom, a snapshot of the moment of impact. Investigators use these forensic clues to work backwards, calculating the speed and angle of the bow's descent.
Its descent was very smooth. It had its aerodynamic nose facing into the direction of travel, so there was no tumbling. It was not particularly violent until the very last moment.
They've calculated that the bow came in at an angle of 15 to 30 degrees, and it was traveling fast, about 35 miles, 56 kilometers per hour. The impact was like a gigantic 20,000-ton truck slamming into a snowdrift.
The bow finally reached the bottom. It plowed in to the dirt, almost all the way up to the anchors.
With the Titanic drained, we can see that at the front of the bow, 40 feet, 12 meters of the ship stands above the seabed. That means a full 60 feet, 18 meters must be buried beneath the ocean floor. That's the equivalent of a 6-story building. With a new picture of the wreck, investigators gain insight into a vital moment in the Titanic tragedy. But as the team continues to study the bow, they are also looking for information about the most iconic moment of all. The impact with the iceberg. We've drained the Titanic. For the first time, we can see the wreck in its entirety, in unprecedented detail. The stunning vistas unleashed by the new model bring the Titanic back to life. With the waters stripped away, her story is laid out in plain sight.
People think science is above emotion. You know, when you're looking at the boat deck where you know so many people said goodbye to one another, lovers and family members said goodbye, these are important points on that ship.
Like the mast of the Crow's Nest, where lookout Frederick Fleet first spotted the oncoming iceberg. The bridge, where Captain Smith shouted his final orders. These portholes, where Titanic crew and passengers witnessed the disaster worsen. And the decks, where loved ones said last goodbyes. With the ocean waters removed, the ship's bow gleams in the bright daylight for the first time in over 100 years.
Despite the violence of the sinking and all that time on the bottom, what's inside that bow in particular is still a ghostly sense of the ship that was.
With Titanic drained, it's crystal clear. The ship is frozen in time. And now, investigators can examine the most iconic mystery of all: the iceberg impact. Eyewitness records prove the Titanic took around 2.5 hours to sink. The official 1912 accident report states that the iceberg tore a gigantic 300-foot gash in the ship's right-hand side, ripping open over a third of her entire hull. But does a massive hole like this exist? Oceanic explorer P.H. Nargeolet has made 30 trips, 12,000 feet, nearly 3,800 meters down to the Titanic. But he's never seen the 300-foot hole.
We were trying to find where the Titanic hit the iceberg, why it was like that, why we saw some crack, why there is a crack here and not here.
Investigators turn to the ultra-high-resolution photo mosaics of the bow wreckage to see what new evidence there might be.
The profile mosaics show Titanic in a way that people hadn't seen it before. No one had done a profile view of Titanic's bow in the 25 years that people have been going to Titanic.
Bill Lang and his team at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Massachusetts have stitched together thousands of images of the bow's hull to create a photo mosaic unlike anything seen before. This is a unique view of the ship and gives Titanic experts the ability to study every last rivet and every piece of steel sheeting that makes up the bow's outer shell.
When you look at the wreck site, you've got to approach it rather clinically, like you would an aircraft crash or an automobile wreck. You look at the individual parts, you ask yourself, how did these parts get here?
The photo mosaics give a clear view of a massive hole in the bow's hull. But experts know that this crack opened when the Titanic collided with the sea floor. Even with these pin-sharp images, they find no sign of anything approaching a 300-foot tear. When they scan the bow closer, they find another clue.
Right above the sediment line, there's a row of plates in the bow where it seems like you can just see empty rivet holes.
This is the evidence they've been searching for years to find. But surprisingly, it's not what they expected.
The actual iceberg damage appears to be confined to maybe a 30-foot length of the bow. It wasn't like a gash, and it wasn't tens of small gashes.
They estimate the size of gaps and puncture holes in the hull add up to just 11 square feet, 1 square meter. A breach in the hull this size would allow 1,400 liters of seawater to gush in every second. And when they analyze how quickly this would have sunk the Titanic, it turns out to be 2.5 hours, exactly the time the Titanic actually took to sink. It's an enduring mystery solved. The iceberg that collided with Titanic didn't rip a 300-foot tear in the hull. There is just no physical evidence. And it's unlikely it's buried below the seabed, because a hole that big would have sunk Titanic in minutes, and not the 2.5 hours it took. But the iceberg still inflicted enough structural damage to trigger an epic disaster. But for our team, there's an even bigger question looming.
During the sinking, there was a great cleavage right through the number 3 funnel. And the bow separated from the stern and began its descent.
How, when, and why did the ship tear in two, separating bow from stern? The answer is here, in broad daylight, on the drained sea floor in the exposed wreck of Titanic. We're peeling back the Atlantic Ocean, draining its waters to view the wreckage of Titanic. This is what the ship looks like today, without 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers of pitch-black ocean blocking out the sun. Less than a kilometer beyond the massive bow section, at the far end of the debris fields, lies the dismembered stern the back end of the ship. It's the second largest fragment, 392 feet, 120 meters long. But it's immediately obvious that it's in very different condition than the bow.
The stern is a mess. It looks like it's been ripped up like confetti.
The stern today is pure chaos.
Some of the stern's huge metal components are still intact, like the 40-foot, 12-meter-high engines, each the size of a house. But our highly detailed model also shows decks collapsing as if crushed together. Heavy steel beams are twisted and torn like straws.
It's hard to figure out what you're looking at. To me, it almost looks like a giant piece of metal sitting on the seafloor, but tough to make it out as a piece of a ship.
Why is it in such bad condition? Investigators have long struggled to explain this.
The stern section has its problems in interpretation because it's so completely broken up.
But within the model, there is a vital clue, something that could unlock its violent story.
On the acoustic map, you can see that the stern was turning counterclock.
It's a massive mark carved into the seabed where the stern crashed. Scientists can read the tracks and interpret how the stern impacted the sea floor.
You can see very well when the stern hit the bottom, the stern was still turning. You can see the bottom of the ship on port side, showing that the stern was turning in the same time.
The marks also let investigators work out the speed of impact. It's estimated that the stern sinks at 50 miles, 80 kilometers per hour, faster than the bow section. Massive drag forces pull on the structure of the stern as it spins through its descent. While the bow is hydrodynamic in shape, cutting cleanly through the water, the stern section spirals chaotically. The damage it suffers during its fall is absolutely catastrophic.
If you have a plane that's damaged in flight, the air will get under the skin of the plane and rip pieces off.
The same thing was happening to Titanic's rapidly disintegrating stern.
At first, large chunks came off, and then once the structure resisted, small pieces like confetti started to fly away.
Investigators think high-pressure water may have plowed into the ship's internal structure, slamming through the ship's interior walls.
Once the hull is separated from the frames, water will blast through. It'll form a ram. All those interior walls were wooden, and they didn't stand a chance. Once the water started coming through at full force, they were pulverized.
To the team, this helps explain why the stern appears so completely destroyed, while the bow section remains intact. With new evidence, another mystery is solved. The investigation has now shown how the two main sections of the ship reached the ocean floor, how they made impact, and why they look so completely different. But there's still one question to tackle. How and when did Titanic break apart? With cutting-edge technology, we've drained away ocean waters and exposed the final resting place of Titanic. After 100 years in dark, frigid waters, her decks once more feel the warmth of the sun. Around the bow and the stern, massive debris fields extend out into the seabed. For investigators, it's a view they've never seen before. Every new artifact they find is a potential new clue to understanding how and why Titanic broke apart. For years, the dominant theory has been that Titanic broke in two at the surface. As the sinking bow angled down, lifting the stern high in the air, its own unsupported weight became too much. The ship's midsection is crushed under the pressure, and the bow and the stern tear apart. With the ocean now drained away, new clues are emerging that could undermine that theory. By looking at the way debris spilled from the ship, the team hopes to get an exact picture of how and where it tore apart. But getting the answer requires a massive effort. The team scans dozens of hours of video taken by robotic cameras to ID and tag the position of as many objects as possible. They build a massive digital database of artifacts from the ocean floor. It includes the position of the more than 5,000 items previous expeditions have recovered from the wreck. Artifacts that tell the story of the Titanic. Like ornate statues from the ship's grand stairway. Chandeliers that once hung in the first-class smoking room. And the finest dishes from Titanic's dining rooms. There's even one of the ship's bronze bells. And pieces of nautical equipment from the captain's bridge. These are precious objects from the legendary ship. But for forensic archaeologists, they are also critical data points that, item by item, reshape the model they are building. A model that could help rewrite the story of how the ship came apart.
The patterns that are emerging from this remapping of the site don't fit any of the traditional models that were there before.
This work will take years to complete.
There's coffee cups, dinner plates, bits of chandeliers, deck benches. It's full of objects from the ship, but also personal objects as well.
Every data point on the map is a story in itself. A touchstone that reveals a detail of life on Titanic's ill-fated voyage.
These were all real people who had lives, who had people who loved them, families who were impacted by what happened on that night.
Delicate jewelry, perfume bottles. To whom did they belong?
It's just a very beautiful, very emotional moment just to see everything lying there on the ground. It's a visual story of that tragedy.
After years of research, Chief Conservator Alex Klingelhofer is able to tie artifacts to specific individuals.
This is a pocket watch, an open face-styled watch. This one still has its hands. It probably stopped when it was immersed in the water.
The watch came from this spot on the debris field, 120 meters east of the stern.
It belonged to Thomas William Solomon Brown. He was a hotelier from South Africa, and he was headed with his family to make a new start in the western part of the United States. He did not survive. However, his wife and his daughter Edith did.
Other passengers even left behind written traces of their lives, still legible after a century in the water. A notebook was found near the stern in debris field number 2. It belonged to third-class passenger Edgardo Samuel Andrew.
He was 17 years old. When you look at his belongings, you find school books, You can still see the writing in here, even though it's quite stained. He used a pencil, and the pencil has remained legible. Here, on this page, he's writing his name, I guess practicing writing his name in the correct way. You begin to see just this young boy going third class by himself to America.
Hundreds of Titanic passengers are rescued from the sea. Alex searches for evidence that Edgardo may have been one of them.
Unfortunately, Edgardo did not survive the voyage. That's why this is perhaps such a heart-rending object, because it's his last notations. He's finished with school, he throws his school books into this suitcase, and he heads off to America. And that's the last that we hear of him.
There are hundreds more objects the team has yet to examine, each with the potential to further flesh out the human face of the tragedy.
Oftentimes, history swallows up the ordinary folks. All of us, we just tend to go away. Archaeological sites give us an opportunity to correct that.
Each story is just one of thousands that can be told from the artifacts at this wreck site. And each artifact forms a point in a cloud of data that is now forming a bigger picture. Now, the fully charted debris field is at last able to give investigators new clues as they try to solve a crucial mystery. When, where, and how Titanic broke apart. In the 2.5 hours it took for the Titanic to sink, over 700 people made it off the ship and into lifeboats. Hundreds of these survivors witnessed the sinking. Yet there's always been disagreement about how and when the ship broke apart.
There are still different theories and arguments as to how things exactly happened when the ship tore in two.
Now, some investigators think the new data can prove once and for all what really happened. In recent years, one theory has emerged that the break occurred while the Titanic was still on the surface. We know from eyewitnesses that the stern tilted up out of the water as she sank. It is believed that this created immense stress, tearing the ship completely in two. But Bill Lang now thinks otherwise. According to him, the new data paints a rather different picture. The clues are on the drained ocean floor. To Bill's trained eye, the patterns in the debris field are not random. They are like blood spatter at a crime scene. They tell a story. Now, flooded in daylight for the first time, with every last corner of the debris field scanned and analyzed, he can begin to retrace how Titanic possibly sank.
It's going to tell us a lot more about what happened to the ship after it left the surface, made this 2.5-mile descent to the seafloor, and hopefully tell us more about what happened to Titanic during its breakup.
For Bill, there's one key piece of evidence, visible for the first time here in the images of the exposed ocean floor. The overall size of the debris field. The new survey definitively maps the site, and for the first time, investigators can now see its precise dimensions. And they're not quite the dimensions they expected.
I think the site really isn't that big when you consider the size of the ship. I mean, you've got a almost 1,000-foot-long ship that's in 2 square miles.
If the ship had fully separated on the surface, Bill Lang thinks there'd be a much larger scatter area.
considering that it fell a few miles through the water column, I think that the scattering of artifacts is rather small.
The lower in the water the main separation occurs, the less distance debris has to spread out as it falls, and the more compact the pattern on the ocean floor. It's a straightforward argument, and for Bill, it's evidence the ship ripped apart much deeper in the water than previously thought. That's the only way he can explain the small scatter pattern.
One of the most important things I think that's come out of this is that the ship may not have broken up as fast and as shallow as what was originally thought.
And when the theory's checked against eyewitness accounts, there's more evidence. The survivors best positioned to see any breakup are 3 men on the aft boat deck. Their statements record the funnels falling away from the ship, but no large-scale breakup, and certainly no snapping in two. Bill and his colleagues have much more work to do before they arrive at final proof. But in their view, there's no other way to explain the small seafloor scatter pattern. To them, one thing already is certain. The Titanic did not break in two on the surface, but further down in the water column. The mountain of data from the expedition has allowed us to drain the ocean and create a new view where we can spot clues that may have been previously missed. All the events of the disaster left traces on the wreckage or in the seabed for us to see. Clues that are bringing the final mysteries of Titanic into focus. But while investigators now have a sharper understanding of the history of the wreck, there's one key mystery they hope to unravel. What will happen to the wreck of Titanic in the future? This is the exposed Titanic as she looks today, after a century of decay, 12,000 feet, nearly 3,800 meters down in the deep waters of the Atlantic. In the 30 years since she was found, no one's been able to see her quite like this. As Titanic investigators study the model, expedition data, and video, it's becoming ever clearer that month by month, year by year, the ship is disappearing. And it's happening faster than some expected. P.H. Nargeolet has been going to the wreck for 3 decades. And he's seen a big change over time.
The distance between the A deck and the B deck was easily 10 feet, now is 5-6 feet. And step by step, the deterioration is going close to the bridge. Soon, all the decks will collapse on each other, and everything inside will be lost forever.
Investigators want to know why it's happening so fast. At these depths, there's very little oxygen in the water, so metal should rust extremely slowly. Yet on the expedition footage, they can clearly see the ship caked in strange formations that certainly look like some kind of rust. They've even given them a name, rusticles.
I was absolutely stunned by the size, the colors. They're very orange and brown, and yet when you're close to them, they're greens and purples and reds and yellows and every color of the rainbow.
Laurie Johnson has been studying rusticles on Titanic for years and has made a number of trips down to the ship to better understand what these formations are doing to the wreck. In the lab, Laurie and her colleagues X-ray pieces of rusticle recovered from the ship. What they find inside isn't what they expected. This is no ordinary rust.
The structure inside this hard-looking shell is extremely fragile. They're filled with millions of ducts and tunnels and passageways and all of these little cavities, and all sorts of nutrients are stored in there.
For the other microbiologists on the team, like Roy Cullimore, it's crystal clear. The rusticles are formed by living organisms. And when they run further tests, there's no doubting what these organisms are. Bacteria.
We found 5 different communities of bacteria living inside a rusticle, and then you've got another community living on the outside. Makes them a very complex little beast.
They figure out that some of these little beasts are anaerobic bacteria, life forms that don't need oxygen to survive. Instead, for their energy supply, they extract iron and minerals from the wreck. Like a swarm of microscopic piranhas, billions upon billions of them are feeding on the wreck. They are literally eating the Titanic.
The impact of the rusticles on this extremely large ship is overwhelming.
But the key question by studying these tiny creatures is, what does the future hold for the Titanic? What is the time frame for its final destruction?
If we went back in 500 years, Titanic would look fairly similar to what the bow section looks right now as far as the hull would be. It would still be a very U-shaped, very formal looking docked ship. However, I would expect the deterioration to move from the back to the front so that a lot of the promenade at deck would have fallen onto itself.
But what will we see 1,000 years from now?
I would not be able to tell sort of the size of the magnificent ship that she is today. I would expect that all of the decking would be gone and the bow would be filled with what would look like sort of piles of rust.
If this is the fate of the bow in 1,000 years, what can we expect from the broken up stern?
If you revisited the stern section, you would see that the deterioration had greatly increased, simply because the damage that section had sustained during the sinking. The bacteria would have taken girders and basically had encrusted them in rusticles and deteriorated to the point of being a pile of iron ore at the bottom of the seafloor.
There is no doubt as to the fate of the great ship over the next 100, and if not 1,000 years. It will erode and disappear into the seabed. And at the heart of its destruction is a small microscopic organism feeding on the once mighty unsinkable ship. But long before this happens, the Titanic's custodians have to make some tough decisions.
What do we do? Do we stand by and allow the bow section to collapse upon itself? Or in the future, do we actually design some projects for recovery of certain types of artifacts from the bow section?
But any suggestion of bringing up more artifacts is controversial. For some descendants of those who lost their lives, this is a gravesite and should be left alone. Initially, Dave Gallo agreed, but since the objects have been put on display, he's less sure.
We went to see the Titanic exhibit and realized then what a powerful storytelling method it was to have some of those artifacts with you, so you could show someone.
For me, the artifacts are the historical memory of the ship. We can leave everything on the bottom of the ocean forever, and it will be lost.
However badly the Titanic deteriorates, one thing's for certain. Thanks to the new science, the ship now will never be lost. The edge of the site's been defined for the first time, so its archaeology can be protected. Every millimeter of the wreck inside the perimeter has been scanned and analyzed. Every known artifact logged, mapped, and captured in this digital world that will never erode. Frozen in time, we can see and study the wreck like never before. In broad daylight, explorers now and in the future can continue their investigation. Here, on the drained ocean floor, where the Titanic rests.